what they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is, of course, Michael Granado. This is going to be a slightly different sort of video, as you could probably tell from the little introductory clip there. The presidential debates were last night, of course. I don't really do a whole lot of political content on this channel. I don't make explicit political videos. I've talked, of course, about political issues. I've interviewed people, for example, who have talked about abortion and COVID-19, and I make several videos talking about conspiracy theories, conspiratorial thinking, and kind of the rise of Christian nationalism. So I do address loosely political issues, but not explicit like conversations about policy. And I'm not really going to do that in this video. This video is just kind of a reflection, I guess, just my general thoughts about having watched the presidential debate last night. I guess I'm making this out of concern. This has been concerning to me for quite some time, especially as a history and philosophy educator, because presidential debates have never been kind of... So there are good debate tactics. There are good debates that you can watch on YouTube. I'm a big fan of watching like debates and conversations between like Christians and atheists, for example, different philosophical positions, philosophers who fundamentally disagree with each other coming together to argue for their different position. I think there's not necessarily merit in debate, but it's good sometime, especially when there's academic disagreement between professionals, to have a platform to vocalize those differences, to see exactly where people stand, and to give people a sense of what the arguments actually are. I can't really say that that's the case with political debates. I'm not sure that political debates actually help anyone, or that I am not under any impression that political debates or debates of any kind actually persuade people. But the idea behind a debate, at least, is to clearly articulate one's position, to let the audience know clearly, distinctly what exactly you are representing. And what's really concerning to me, what happened last night and what has happened since, I believe it was 2016 was the first time that Trump ran. My current memory is all out of whack because of COVID, and the lockdown completely distorted my sense of time, as I'm sure some of you can relate to. But there's been a tangible shift in the sort of rhetoric that's been utilized in politics. Specifically, what concerns me is the rise of what I would identify as conspiratorial thinking. Now, bad arguments have always occupied a space within political discord since there's been political debates that have been publicly televised to people. I used to use political debates as an example of how not to argue in my critical thinking class. And we saw some classic examples of this on both sides last night with typical politicians' answers, right? This is a sort of fallacy in which somebody asks you a direct question: do you support position X, Y, or Z? And instead of answering their question directly by saying, yes, I support position X because of this reason, instead you start talking, and then in your speech, you kind of gradually shift over to a different talking point that you really wanted to talk about. So you can go completely change the answer and completely shift the direction and the dynamic of the conversation to suit the talking point that you originally had in mind. All politicians do this. Politicians are known for dancing around the question, for evading giving a straight answer, and sticking to the talking points that they originally came to the debate in order to promote. That's standard practice, and most Americans are aware of that. But when I say conspiratorial thinking, that's not really what I'm talking about here, conspiratorial thinking is a bit more insidious. And we saw that with Trump's answer to the question about immigration. Specifically, it was asked of Vice President Harris. There was recently a bipartisan bill that she backed that was recently shot down in Congress that had both Democrat and Republican support for it. And the reason it was shot down is believed because Donald Trump wanted it to be shot down. And when asked why he wouldn't back bipartisan legislation to address the immigration crisis, this is where you get his answer about immigrants eating pets. And what stood out to me is one, the absurdity of that claim, the idea that when asked a substantive question, this was a really good question, and we don't even have to talk about immigration in order to recognize that it was a good question. There was a thing that was going to happen that had bipartisan support, that was addressing an issue that you have built your platform around, immigration. If you notice throughout like the first hour of the debate, every question that was asked, Trump brought it back to immigration. So this is a issue and a concern that is very important to him, his platform, and his followers. And when he was asked a direct question of that, he started to talk about immigrants eating pets in Springfield specifically. And I identify this as conspiratorial thinking because this is a claim that has been thoroughly denied by news outlets in Springfield. I believe it was referenced that the mayor of Springfield had denied that there was any sort of substance to these claims. It's been fact checked by numerous different websites across the political spectrum, and there's simply no evidence for this claim. And when Trump was given pushback against this, when it was brought to his attention that there's not evidence to support this and that we're getting this information and statistics from the FBI, Trump doubled down and said, well, they're wrong. And so this is conspiratorial because it's a hallmark of conspiratorial thinking when presented with what is considered mainline or mainstream evidence. The response to that is to say that those sources are either intentionally misleading, that they're lying to you for some reason. That reason is typically to cover up some truth, to cover up some fact, that you have the correct sources, that you have the right information. And the reason why conspiratorial thinking is considered inherently faulty, at least logically speaking, is because it goes against the very nature of evidence. So what I mean by that is I used to believe seemingly straightforward. If you and I were to have a conversation about something that we might disagree on, whatever that might be, whether it's the nature of spirituality, the existence of the supernatural, a debate about the history of science, that's usually what I get most riled up about, right? If you and I were to have some disagreement about some issue in the history, let's say we're talking about Galileo and whether or not Galileo's case represents an example of conflict between science and religion. If I were to argue that it does not represent a conflict between science and religion, the expectation there is that I would be able to support the claims that I'm making about history with substantive evidence. Now, the nature of evidence dictates that that information is available to both parties. If I'm trying to convince you of my position, I present you with that evidence for you to review and for you to understand where exactly I'm coming from. Now, granted, in the sort of presidential debates that I'm reviewing and that we're talking about here, that sort of reviewing of evidence is not really possible. And that's not really the point of these debates. Like I said at the beginning, the point is just to articulate one's position to as wide of an audience as possible. Usually that's the point. I'm not saying that's what happened here. But the idea here is that evidence is clearly accessible and tangible to both sides. When one side claims to have evidence that is not available, that has been hidden, that has been kept secret, or that for whatever reason is restricted from one party or another, that's where we start to enter into the realm of conspiratorial thinking. And hopefully the reasons for that is pretty clear. You can see this, for example, in if you've listened to conversations and debates about the existence of extraterrestrials and whether or not extraterrestrials have visited Earth. There's a lot of situations in which a person will say, yes, there was evidence. So, for example, Roswell is kind of the classic example of this. The people who believe that a alien spacecraft crashed in Roswell, New Mexico back in the 50s, late 40s, 50s. I could be wrong about that. There was evidence, there was physical evidence found by people, but what happened to that evidence, the government came and gathered and took it all. So it's no longer available to us to examine. So instead, what we're left with eyewitness reports and firsthand accounts of the events. And this, I would think, is a pretty similar example, if not a very silly example, where we have the claim that immigrants are eating pets. And you say, well, the information, we don't have any reason to believe that that's the case. Where are you getting that information? And so far, we haven't seen any credible source where that's the case. So, why is this being promoted and why is this being discussed on the largest of levels during a presidential debate, if not to characterize and to provide a certain type of characterization of the sort of people who are immigrating in order to appeal to this base sort of emotional appeal that the people who are immigrating are somehow other, are somehow lesser than, and in a very crude sort of way to fundamentally dehumanize these people. And the dehumanization is done obviously for particular political reasons, to pass rather extreme or harsh or whatever sort of language you want to do legislation against this particular group, which is founded upon conspiratorial thinking. And hopefully, all of us, no matter what our political position, can see the danger in that sort of thought. Well, I'm going to keep this very short because I don't want to get out into the weeds here, but let me know what you thought about last night's debate, about this particular claim, and I'll see you all next time.